Thank you, Marco. Thank you for inviting me to the conference, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Arizona. Although I think I would have been even more pleased to have the meeting been taking place in December to come here from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is already beginning to freeze. I know that I'm the only thing standing between you and the end of the conference, so I promise not to speak for too long. And if there are questions at the end, I'll be happy to talk about them. The title of the talk, More Power, Less Autonomy, seeks to investigate what I see as a puzzle or a tension in ongoing decentralization reforms. The talk has the following parts to it, and I'm not going to go through each of them, but the structure of the talk will follow what is listed above. So what does it mean to say that decentralization reforms related to the governance of renewable resources in the past 3 decades can be characterized by the phrase, more power, less autonomy? Power for whom and whose autonomy? And if the target of greater powers and lesser autonomy is the same, as this talk suggests, that is, lower-level decision-making bodies in a territorial administrative hierarchy, then how can greater powers be compatible with lesser autonomy? I will address these questions today with reference to ongoing decentralization reforms in 3 sectors: pastoralism of rangeland, range resources, irrigation, and fisheries. The argument is based on information drawn from 56 empirical cases of local level resource management in the fisheries, irrigation, and range sectors. And these cases are identified through extensive keyword searches using the Web of Science's citation databases. They obviously don't constitute the complete listing of everything that has been published in the last 20 years in these 3 sectors around decentralization, but they cut a wide swath through the literature on decentralization in these 3 sectors. So on the basis of the analysis of these cases, I advance the argument that there's a fundamental tension in contemporary decentralization reforms and writings about these reforms. That is, they seek to increase local powers and simultaneously reduce local autonomy. And I'll examine this apparent paradox by looking at the specific ways in which decentralization reforms take place. The examination of the mechanisms that help accomplish decentralization helps also provide a more general framework in which to understand or examine how policy actions tend to or lead to changes in actions and outcomes of individuals or groups of people at lower levels. And finally, the argument advanced in the paper addresses another puzzle in the literature on decentralization. And that is about the divergent political and ethical judgments about what is decentralization. The analysis suggests that these divergent judgments can be understood better by assessing whether analysts of decentralization focus on the greater powers that these reforms create or the limits that they enable on autonomy. So, what is decentralization? There's by now a substantial body of work on decentralization reforms, particularly in the natural resource management sector. Much of this work views decentralization as efforts by governments in which a central government formally cedes powers to actors and institutions at lower levels of a political, administrative, and territorial hierarchy. Devolving powers to lower levels enables the creation of a realm of decision-making in which a variety of local level actors can exercise some autonomy. And I cite this from a piece by Agrawal in 2006. Another group of scholars writing about fisheries co-management say that increasing local autonomy is a focal point in the decentralization process. Generally, powers and authority are transferred or withdrawn by laws enacted at the center. And indeed, a large literature on decentralization treats it as about being an increase in local powers and autonomy, or at least as having that goal. Benjamin describes decentralization as having created new local governments in many countries with political, administrative, and financial autonomy, and I cite this. And in a similar way, Lenar et al. Described decentralization in river basin water management as being characterized by local autonomy in institutional reform. Benet et al. Bemoan the limited local autonomy that results from decentralization related to inland fisheries in Africa. And I have a whole bunch of other references, but I won't go through all of them. But the basic point I want to make is that there's a large body of work on decentralization that sees it as simultaneously about increasing local autonomy and increasing local capacities and powers as a result of the transfer of powers to local governments by a central or a higher level government. And what I want to suggest is that in these approaches for defining decentralization, there's a pervasive conflation of power with autonomy. And even when some authors recognize the limited autonomy that actually results from specific decentralization reforms that they are describing or discussing, they don't view these limits as being about the very nature of decentralization or contemporary decentralization policies. They view assertions by governments that decentralization seeks to increase autonomy at face value instead of examining the extent to which limits on autonomy are a characteristic feature of most decentralization reforms, or whether there's a distinction between increases in powers and capacities of local decision makers and changes in their autonomy. In this paper, I suggest that even where central governments grant greater local decision-making powers, allocate more resources, provide more taxing authority, increase information availability, or provide training and a host of other steps for which decentralization reforms stand, increases in local autonomy as a result of decentralization are difficult to identify. Of course, many authors have suggested that decentralization reforms often don't even increase local powers. This paper argues that even when they do, it still limits local autonomy. Decentralization still limits local autonomy. To understand the nature of the relationship between power and autonomy in the context of decentralization reform, it's useful to begin with some empirical evidence on what decentralization reforms do and how goals of changes in central-local relationships are enacted under different efforts to decentralize. More specifically, what are the links and mechanisms through which localities connect with extra-local institutions and institutional arrangements? So, reforms of natural resource governance under decentralization policies typically do three things. They identify a set of local level decision makers and organizations to whom new responsibilities are assigned or new powers are allocated. They develop a set of roles and tasks for the local level decision makers, and they evolve new institutional arrangements through which the new roles will be performed by these new actors. Central governments often create new local organizations or decision-making bodies and establish formal authority, reporting, financial, and accountability relationships with these bodies if they don't see old institutions or existing institutions as being organizations as being appropriate. Indeed, most studies that discuss the origins of local resource management arrangements also discuss or describe the extent to which central government agencies played a role in creating these organizations. Existing local organizations, of course, may also be traditional and long enduring, or, as I said, they may be recent and related to other sets of reforms. They are usually used to channel centrally provided resources, influence, and regulatory authority. New local organizations, when governments resort to them, serve similar purposes but often at higher costs. In both cases, whether central governments rely on existing institutions or fashion them anew, a range of mechanisms is necessary to forge the needed governance links, processes, and incentives through which central governments can influence local outcomes. To increase effectiveness, reform measures can use increased frequency of interactions between central and local office holders, new forms of reporting, monitoring, accountability, different approaches to managing information and finances, and tighter connections between decision makers at local levels. Indeed, the importance central governments accord to creating effective means of articulation with local agencies should lead one to doubt whether the policy reforms granting greater responsibilities and authority should be termed decentralization. If anything, what's called decentralization is a set of efforts to better integrate the different levels and mechanisms of governance and the exercise of power at these different levels and through these mechanisms. Thus, an analysis of how decentralization reforms work and to show how they are about increasing local powers but limiting local autonomy, it's necessary to attend, one, to the actors that are charged with new responsibilities, two, the kinds of tasks that they are charged with, three, the mechanisms through which they come to exercise additional powers, and four, the channels of influence through which new monitoring, reporting, accountability, and supervision are required. Differences in these four aspects of local central relationships appear to have clear patterns across the three renewable resource sectors that are examined in this talk, particularly in terms of the frequency with which different mechanisms are used to connect local actors with central governments. The ensuing discussion reaches three key conclusions that I wanted to state. One, the term decentralization is a misnomer because the institutional reform processes that we identify across different sectors is less one of central governments giving up control, more one of efforts to use new powers for local authorities so as to develop more integrated decision-making mechanisms to regulate the use of natural resources. Two, the chief characteristic of this attempt to integrate decision-making across scales is greater powers and responsibilities to local decision-makers to simultaneously reduce autonomy. And three, the distinction between power and autonomy, critical to understand how decentralization allows regulatory powers to operate at a distance from the central administrative or political authorities. That distinction is also central to understanding one of the major tensions in contemporary writings on decentralization. What is this tension? It is basically that a substantial scholarship on the subject valorizes decentralization as a way to increasing local capacities and control, increasing participation, improving efficiency and effectiveness of governance. But an even more vociferous group of scholars see decentralization reforms as a Trojan horse, as an attempt by central governments to consolidate authority, increase their reach and power at the expense of local decision makers, and their damning criticism that is advanced. Decentralization is a prime example of neoliberal strategies of rule. The analysis that I will present in the talk suggests that both these views of decentralization reforms are highly partial. The metaphorical use of the phrase more power, less autonomy is then a sorting device through which to navigate the opposing conclusions of writings on decentralization. Those who critique it as a Trojan horse and those who valorize it as a good thing. Because the first group, those who critique it, tend to focus primarily on the processes through which local autonomy is limited, and the second group tends to focus mainly on the processes through which responsibilities and powers at the local level are enhanced.